I made a little show and tell where I made an argument for the 90s and then countered it. Mike says that's okay.
I think you're doing great.
Thanks. The 90s had Friends. The 80s had fucking Alf. What are you writing, Janeane? What are you jotting down so quickly? All right. The 90s had the swing dancing revival. The 80s had poppin' and lockin'. I don't think that's poppin' and lockin', but... The 90s had Mrs. Doubtfire. Had Mrs. Doubtfire. The 80s had Mr. T.
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, Mike, get in the cave, boy.
The 90s had the Counting Crows. Well, the 80s had a bird-named band of its own with fucked up hair. Motherfucking Flock of Seagulls. The 90s had the Lilith Fair. The 80s had Lilith Crane. The 90s had Weezer and the Sweater Song. The 80s had Bill Cosby sweaters. The 90s had Morrissey. But the 80s had the Smiths. The 90s had the Fresh Prince. The 80s had Prince. The 90s had Frosted Tips. I think this setup is going to be better than the punchline. Because the 80s had Frosted Mini Wheats. Frosted Mini Wheats. Well, it doesn't make perfect. It's frosted. Both are frosted. Well, you can make that argument when it's, you can tell. No, this is my time. This is my time. Go ahead, Janeane. No, go ahead. I want to hear what you're saying.
I'm just saying Frosted Mini Wheats and Prince still existed through the 90s.
No, but he changed his name.
Artist formerly, but he's still...
If I might, the 80s Prince was busy trying to fuck his sister and was wearing tiny purple boots, and the 90s Prince wore yellow assless chaps and had slave written on his forehead.
No, but...
Score one for the 80s.
I hear your point, Janeane, but I still think it makes sense what I'm saying. The 90s had mood rings. The 80s had moody actors. The 90s had stoned wash jeans. The 80s had Gene Simmons. And the 80s. The 90s had scrunchies. The 80s had the Iran-Contra affair. The 90s had mini backpacks. Janeane, do you want to guess what the 80s had for mini backpacks?
Fanny packs.
Frosted mini wheats. That's my time.
You got him, Mike.